Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. Peggy Haldane knew something was wrong. She hadn't heard a word from her mother in months. It wasn't like her. They visited regularly and exchanged letters nearly every day. But since she left for Edinburgh, her mother was silent. It was as if she dropped off the end of the earth. So Peggy decided to go in search of her, retracing her steps as best she could. She even rented a room in the same boarding lodge as her mother, Tanner's Close. The owner of the establishment was very friendly. Although he didn't remember much about the woman at all, except how charming she was and how much she talked about her daughter, he offered to do what he could. And they made plans to search town the next morning. That evening, he invited her for a nightcap of his favorite whiskey. The drink and conversation flowed from there. Although she knew she really should have stopped with a drink or two, it was hard to tell her host no. She ended up passing out. At which point, Hare put down his drink, wrapped his hand over her mouth and nose, and suffocated her. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. Following their standard operating procedure to the letter, Hare placed her body in a tea chest and hustled it off to the University of Edinburgh's chief anatomist, Dr. Robert Knox. The anatomist didn't ask where Burke was, never taking his eye off the pristine body for a moment, and paid Hare £8. There was a reason Hare was able to pocket the cash without his partner being any the wiser. Following Mrs. Haldane's murder, he and McDougal left town to visit her father. While it was a short trip, Burke knew something was off when he returned. He knew his business partner was strapped for cash. Prior to his departure, he'd observed Hare pawning off some of his own clothes just to make ends meet. But when he returned, it seemed that Hare's luck had made a miraculous recovery. Now his buddy was wearing new clothes, even flashing cash around like it was going out of style. Suspicious, he asked if he'd done any business in his absence. Naturally, Hare denied it. But when he checked with Knox and learned of the recent transaction involving Peggy's body, he knew he was being played a fool. When Burke confronted him about being cut out of the profit, a heated argument erupted and the pair came to blows. That night, Burke and McDougal moved to his cousin's home 2 blocks away and began taking lodgers themselves. In terms of taking one's marbles and going home, it was a valiant effort, but one that didn't last long. The couples kissed and made up before week's end. They resumed killing for profit soon after, taking advantage of the expanded locations. One day, while Hare was visiting Burke at the new house, a washerwoman named Mrs. Osler arrived to take the laundry. It's not clear why, but they decided she too should go in the box. They got her drunk, smothered her, and took her to Knox that afternoon before anyone was the wiser. They probably figured their next victim was an easy enough mark. He was a village local named Jamie Wilson. Wilson was an 18-year-old mentally disabled man known throughout town as Daft Jamie. Unable to perform labor jobs due to a severely deformed foot, Wilson spent much of his time roaming the streets begging. Like other victims, Wilson was lured to Tanner's Close with a bottle of whiskey. and while he was finishing it, Hare signaled Margaret to fetch Burke. When Wilson was adequately pissed, the men led him back to a bedroom where Margaret locked the door from the outside and pushed the key under a mat. Once he was successfully bumped off, the men would then be able to release themselves before carting him off to Knox. At least, that was the plan. But the thing is, Wilson wasn't a really big drinker. He preferred snuff, powdered tobacco that was inhaled through the nostrils. So while he was a little sleepy from the drink, he wasn't nearly as intoxicated as the men had presumed. This little detail is something that Hare could have, and let's face it, should have been aware of. But then again, Hare wasn't really big on details, was he? Unlike the other victims, all sickly, elderly, and predominantly female, Wilson fought back. And he was much stronger than the men figured him to be. Wilson struggled valiantly for his life, but in the end was overpowered. When his body was stripped and his few possessions stolen, Burke kept his snuff box and Hare a small spoon. When the pair took his body to Knox the next day, students immediately recognized the body in the tea chest as Wilson's and became alarmed. Taking possession and eager to stamp out objections, Knox chastised the men for their silly, womanish imaginations. There was no way they could tell the identity of a body, he insisted. But the students knew better, and word soon spread. When Wilson's mother and sister noticed him missing and organized a search, Knox must have been worried. He opted to dissect Wilson's body ahead of the others held much longer in storage. He also instructed his assistants to cover the face with a cloth. When even this wasn't enough to quell the gasps and whispers of students observing in the theater, Knox promptly lopped off the man's head and foot before yelling at the gallery to control themselves. It's hard to tell at what point the men stopped being greedy and just presumed they were invincible. By all appearances, their outward behavior never changed. They maintained the image of friendly, approachable folk, even businessmen. And Burke never left the church. But farming people for profit did change them, and when it finally went too far, it also brought them down. A week or two after Wilson's murder, one of Helen's relatives, a woman named Anne McDougall, visited the couple from Falkirk. She survived less than 3 days before the men killed her and sold her to Knox for a 10 spot. But it seems that the murder opened a rift between the couples. Margaret started to get antsy, wondering if Helen would have a change of heart and turn them in. She even suggested to the men that they kill her too. There was just no trusting a Scotchwoman, she said. But in a move that cemented the men's familiar bond, Burke balked and Hare backed him. The matter dropped. But once the idea was entertained, it's hard to believe that it was really forgotten. And maybe it would have come to pass again. Thankfully, we'll never know. Their final victim, a middle-aged woman named Marjorie Campbell Doherty, was killed on Halloween night, 1828. Following a chance meeting, Burke told Doherty he had relations in the old country on his mother's side and that presumably the two were related. If Doherty doubted this, she didn't say anything after Burke and Helen invited her to partake in their finest spirits back at the house. The only problem was, the Burkes currently had paying guests staying with them. James and Anne Gray had rented a room for themselves and their children. That was a lot of potential witnesses. So Hare invited the Grays to stay at his lodge so as not to be disturbed by the the party. Eager to keep the children away from such behavior, the Grays were only too happy to accept. The drinking and frivolity continued well into the evening and eventually encompassed Hare and Margaret as well, as it does when you bump into your friends on your way to buy more booze. But this was part of their plan. After Burke and Helen got the woman loosened up, the Hares would come over. And once the Grays were settled and Doherty was incapacitated, they would strike. Around 9 in the evening, the Grays briefly stopped by to collect some of their children's clothing. As they did this, they saw Burke, Hare, their wives, and Doherty in the common area, singing and dancing and passing a bottle around between them. At one point, the couple was awakened in the night by the sound of a fist fight they presumed was occurring between the two men. Then nothing. According to their confessions, Burke and Hare did engage in a scrap that night. But once it was over, they murdered Doherty and hid her body in a pile of straw at the end of the bed in the guest bedroom the Grays occupied. The next day when they returned to the lodge, the Grays were told Doherty wasn't there. The Burkes claimed Marjorie had a little too much to drink and had become a little too handsy for Helen to abide. It seemed strange. As the ones providing the liquor, they wondered why they didn't just cut her off. Putting a pin in it for the moment, Anne told the pair that she'd forgotten a pair of stockings in the room where they'd been staying and asked if she could retrieve them. To her shock, she was refused. Scoffing at the offense, she curtly informed the Burkes that they were her best pair, and if they thought Helen was going to keep them, they had another thing coming. The couple pushed past their hosts and entered the room, where they discovered Marjorie's body hidden under the bed, her cold, lifeless pallor barely concealed among the shadows. The Grays flipped out, as undoubtedly so did Helen, whose first thought was to attempt to bring them into the conspiracy by offering them a bribe of £10 a week for their silence. But they refused. No amount of money was worth being connected to such heinousness. Perhaps they were worried for their own personal safety as well. They made a quick escape and reported their discovery to the police. But it was too late. By the time the police arrived, Marjorie's body had been delivered to Knox. Unbeknownst to the Grays, their report was just the nudge the police needed to finally recognize that something sinister was going on. They searched the Burkes' home and found Doherty's blood-stained clothing hidden under the bed. When questioned, Burke and his wife claimed that Doherty had left the house. But that was the only thing that was consistent about their stories. They gave totally different versions of the evening's events and widely different times for her supposed departure. To investigators, they couldn't have implicated themselves more had they confessed. Following James Gray's information, Hare and his wife were also contacted and questioned. Each denied any knowledge of the woman or what had transpired at the Burkes. Early the following morning, the constables went to the university and inspected the dissection theater. As the police interviewed Knox, James Gray identified the body laying in his lecture hall as Marjorie Doherty. Her body and what little evidence they could find was seized and taken back to the station. Knox had to know the jig was up, and if he had any compassion at all, at this point should have come clean and cooperated with police. But he didn't. He remained tight-lipped and found countless reasons to be too far away to visit the station and too busy to answer questions. A forensic examination of Doherty's body was conducted, which resulted in more hunches than facts. Suspecting that the middle-aged woman had been suffocated, the police were sure they had multiple murders on their hands, but they were at a loss on how to solve it. With no bodily trauma, and in some cases without a body altogether, they had little to prove it, and even less to prove who did it. Police surgeon Dr. Alexander Black, the 19th century version of a medical examiner, feared he was in over his head. He knew the woman on the medical table met with foul play, but was unable to find any clear signs of such. So the Crown appointed 2 forensic specialists for second opinions, Doctors Christensen and Newbigging, who examined the body and suspected the probable cause of death was suffocation, but were also at a loss on how to medically prove it. Christensen also interviewed Knox, who, without batting an eye, claimed that Burke and Hare obtained their bodies by watching the seedier lodging houses scattered throughout Edinburgh and had purchased the bodies before anyone claimed them for burial. Legally, of course. But the investigating physician found Knox to be, quote, deficient in principle and heart, and his explanations too detailed, too neat and tidy. But aside from his impressions of his character, he still had very little to go on. As unethical as Knox appeared to be, he simply couldn't find any evidence he'd broken the law. But as rumors of the murders began to leak into the press, the public was catching on. With every wildly inaccurate version of the crimes, more people began to have second thoughts of their wayward friends and family members that had dropped off the radar just a little too long. Soon, police stations were flooded with concerned citizens, worried that every missing person was a murder victim. But along with them were people who would soon have to come to terms with the worst, like Janet Baker, who went to the station to make a report and had to identify her friend's clothing, and a local baker who told constables Burke's nephew was running around wearing Jamie Wilson's trousers. On November 3, 1828, a warrant was issued for the arrest and detainment of Burke, Hare, and their wives. The accused were taken into custody, booked, and interviewed for their statements in separate cells. Their alibis were even sloppier than the crimes. Their statements kept changing as each was interrogated. It was not only like each of them was trying to defend a totally different crime, it was like those totally different crimes happened on totally different planets. They couldn't even get their own individual stories straight. So to obtain a conviction, Lord Advocate Sir William Ray, the state's equivalent of a district attorney, followed a time-honored strategy still employed today. He leaned on one member of the syndicate, offered him a plea deal to roll over on his partner, then put him on the stand as the star witness. Weighing the evidence and which party he had the best chance of hanging, he decided to lean on Hare. But why Hare? He had a much larger body count, given he was the one who normally did the smothering. More often than not, Burke was just the muscle. In the absence of so many critical details, the decision probably came down to first impressions. Burke was much older, fancied himself a little more savvy, and loyal. Seeing Hare as a substitute son, he probably refused to cooperate. He knew the police didn't have much to go on, and the chances of the case going to trial, much less obtaining a conviction, were remote, so long as they kept their yaps shut. Perhaps it was a matter of optics, and it just looked better before the court if the younger man was shown mercy. It's not hard to see how the prosecutor might think Hare was manipulated or drawn into a scheme by his older friend. Maybe he saw how blissfully dumb he was and felt sorry for him. Or maybe he saw the look of fear on the young man's face and knew he was an easier target. In any case, the prosecutor made his move. On December 1st, Hare was offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for turning King's evidence against Burke and testifying for the state in regards to the murder of Marjorie Doherty, Mary Patterson, and Jamie Wilson. It was a real honey of a deal because it effectively meant his wife would be spared prosecution as well. Because he couldn't be compelled to testify against Margaret, they wouldn't be able to use his cooperation against her. And that would result in a judgment of not proven. It was certainly not an exoneration or a formal decision of not guilty, but more of the 19th century version of being found not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. On December 4th, 1828, Hare took the lifeline and made a full confession for all 16 murders, giving details, naming names, and as many dates as he could remember. Which probably weren't that reliable. But he did the best he could. Once in receipt, Ray compared it to the evidence they were able to gather and decided he had enough to obtain a conviction. That same day, formal charges were filed against Burke and McDougal for the murders of Patterson, Wilson, and Doherty. At 10 a.m. on Christmas Eve, 1828, the trial at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh's Parliament House was called to order. It was presided by Lord Justice Clerk David Boyle and supported by Lords Meadowbank, Pitmilly, and Mackenzie. The courtroom gallery had filled hours before, and spectators eager for a peek at the proceedings had begun to spill out into the streets. Shortly before 9 a.m., 300 constables were called in for crowd control, and the Scottish infantry and cavalry were put on standby just in case. The first to call out objections was the defense, right at the beginning of the hearing during the reading of the charges. Burke's lawyer objected to the wording of the indictment, as it read his client was charged, quote, with 3 unconnected murders committed each at a different time and at a different place, in a trial with another defendant, quote, who is not even alleged to have had any concern with 2 of the offenses of which he is accused. For her part, McDougal's attorney had a problem with her being tied anywhere near Burke, fearful it prejudiced the jury. These initial legal maneuvers were volleyed back and forth for several hours before the legal panel finally decided, in order to ensure a fair trial and avoid lengthy appeals, the charges should be split into thirds to reflect the 3 separate murders being brought before the court. Boyle left the choice to the prosecution as to which case to try first. The state decided to try Doherty's murder, as they were in possession of the body and therefore the strongest evidence. The pleas were heard just after lunch, when both accused pleaded not guilty and the trial began. Of the over 55 potential witnesses for the prosecution, Knox avoided appearing in court altogether. Instead, he sent his assistant, David Patterson, in his place, who testified to being the main contact between the pair and the doctor's dissection practice, and confirmed the men supplied Knox with several corpses, of which they were compensated. By early evening, it was Hare's turn to appear on the stand. It remains a curious decision to continue proceedings so late the day before a major holiday, but it doesn't seem either side objected, and perhaps they wanted to hear Hare's testimony before he had a chance to reconsider or be killed. Both remained reasonable concerns. Hare testified that Burke, and Burke alone, was responsible for murdering Doherty, and that McDougal participated in the woman's demise by bringing her back to the house after Doherty had tried to escape. Hare said he'd only participated in delivering the body to Knox, but by then Doherty was long dead. It was distasteful, yes, but not criminal. And not grave robbing, as Doherty had never been afforded a burial in the first place. Hare avoided having to answer for the other murders, including Wilson. The court sustained objections when he was asked about them, on account that the scope of the proceedings pertained only to Doherty. Having satisfied his obligations to the court, he was excused and returned to his cell. As the night dragged on, the prosecution's last witnesses were Doctors Black and Christensen, who stated they suspected foul play, but that there were no outright signs to confirm this. With that, the prosecution rested. The only witness who appeared on behalf of the defense was McDougal herself, who entered the witness box with her and Burke's baby in her arms. Besides being an obvious grab for sympathy, the baby girl had recently contracted whooping cough, and cradled in her mother's arms was positioned in such a way that made breathing difficult. During her testimony, the child frequently broke into coughing fits, which McDougal used to her advantage, giving herself time to think before answering. Her answers came across as very thoughtful and deliberate dodges. She told the court she'd a very poor memory for details and struggled to recall specific events. No witnesses testified for Burke. Jurors merely heard a repeat of his pretrial pleads instead. But surprisingly, at this point, the Lords didn't call for a recess. For that matter, neither did the prosecution or the defense. Perhaps in an attempt to move their community past the horror, the court remained in session and pressed on. The prosecution finished delivering their final arguments at 3 the next morning, followed by 2 hours of closing by Burke's defense attorney, then McDougal's. It was well into Christmas Day by the time Lord Boyle gave his final instructions and sent the jury to deliberate. They returned with a verdict just 50 minutes later. Just before 10 that morning, as the faithful were preparing to go to Mass, it was finally announced: Burke was guilty. Upon delivering the death sentence, Lord Boyle said, quote, "Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized. And I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." Boom. While awaiting his sentence, Burke made 2 confessions and still didn't manage to give any more answers. His first official confession was given on January 3, 1829, to the undersheriff, the prosecutor fiscal, and the assistant sheriff clerk. Transcribed by the clerk, it read in part, quote, "Dr. Knox never encouraged him, neither taught or encouraged him to murder any person." The statement was enough to ensure Knox faced no charges related to the murders, and the police quickly moved to close the case on the surgeon. But as public interest shifted, so did coverage in the newspapers, and the public was not nearly so generous. The common man, many not much better off educationally or financially than Burke himself, saw Knox as the perpetrator. Or, as one reporter put it, quote, "a sinister ringmaster who got Burke and Hare dancing to his tune." The argument had merit. Would either man be driven to cold-blooded murder if Knox wasn't willing to pay for the bodies? Weren't they, their victims, and a large part of society pawns of the same vicious system? Along with editorials opining Knox deserved a cell right next to Burke and Hare, a rhyme began to circulate. Up the close and down the stair, Butt and Ben with Burke and Hare, Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef. Then, on the advice of both a Catholic priest and a Presbyterian clergyman, Burke made another confession. In addition to again relieving Knox of any responsibility, this one was more detailed than the original and placed much of the blame for the murders on Hare. The second version appeared in an article for the Edinburgh Courant that was published in February 7, 1829. Right away, followers of the story noted the contradictions between version 1 and version 2, and that between both men's versions of the events as well, which left many questions researchers have struggled to answer since. But this is what happens when criminals focus more on murder than posterity. It's something we have to accept. Outraged by the decision to let him go, attorneys for Jamie Wilson's mother and sister filed a petition opposing Hare's immunity deal and proposed release from prison. It was considered by the High Court of Justiciary on January 16th and rejected by a vote of 4-2. It seemed to the family they were never going to see justice for Jamie. His murderer was going to walk away a free man. Without any evidence directly tying her to the crimes, the jury found that the charges against Helen were not proven. That was good enough to allow her to avoid the hangman's noose, so she took it. She was released on January 19th and returned home. The next day, she went to buy whiskey and was accosted by an angry mob. She was taken to a police station in nearby Fountain Bridge for her own protection, but after the mob turned their rage towards the station, she escaped through a back window. She absconded to Edinburgh's High Street station to see Burke, but was refused. The following day, she headed to Glasgow for passage to Ireland. But as she waited to board, she fell victim to another crowd of angry locals who nearly finished the job. She was rescued by a sympathetic police officer who escorted her back to the station. Once her attackers dispersed, she was put on the first ship bound for Belfast. But much of this is only speculation. No one really knows what became of her. Margaret's charges, too, were found not proven. She fled the country following her release, but continued to be haunted by an angry public seeking her death. She never saw Hare again and died in hiding. Knox refused to make any public statements about his involvement with the murderous pair, but his stiff-lipped silence did little to exonerate him in the court of public opinion. He came off looking more like an evil, classist villain and was chastised as such by the press for years. After a committee of his peers cleared him of complicity and an inquiry board reported having, quote, seen no evidence that Knox or his assistants knew that murder was committed in procuring any of the subjects brought into their rooms, he tried to continue business as usual, but failed. Amidst the outrage and damage to his reputation, he was pressured to resign his post as curator of the College of Surgeons Museum and was blacklisted at the university. All but barred from practicing medicine in Edinburgh, he left the country in 1842 for a lecture tour of Europe. In the years to come, he would move to Britain in an attempt to salvage his career, but the stain of his association with Burke and Hare followed him wherever he went. While practicing in London, he was found in violation again, and the Royal College of Surgeons barred him from lecturing. In another shot to his reputation, the Royal Society of Edinburgh removed him from their rolls in 1848. Knox limped along professionally for years, never being able to retain the respect and prestige he desired. He died the worst possible way he could imagine, as a nobody, in 1862. Burke was hanged in January 28, 1829, before a crowd of 25,000. The demand for a seat at the execution was so great, tenement residents with windows overlooking the scaffold could rent them out for nearly 20 shillings apiece. In keeping with the law of the time, his corpse was sent to Old College Medical School for dissection. The crowd of eager spectators easily outnumbered the seating in the anatomy theater, and the police had to be called in to dissuade trouble. Even this did little to slow public demand. Only after-school administrators arranged for additional viewings of the dissection remains were they able to avoid a riot. And even then, it took hours for those interested to file through in groups of 50. The scholar permitted to do the task, Professor Monroe, took 2 hours with the body. When finished, he dipped his quill pen into Burke's remains and wrote, quote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged in Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." It wasn't all science preserved. A macabre calling card case was fashioned from a smuggled piece of Burke's skin, and his death mask was included among the displays at the college. His skeleton was displayed at the Medical School of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum, where, as of 2022, it remains. After extending his stay for his own protection, Hare was released from custody on February 5, 1829. To avoid vigilantes, he was smuggled out of town on a mail coach headed to Dumfries, dressed in disguise. On one of those stops, he was recognized by a barrister representing the Wilson family, who outed him to his fellow passengers. By the time he arrived in Dumfries, a large mob was there to greet him. Terrified at the possibility of retribution, the proprietor of the hotel, which arranged to keep him for the night, called for the police. They arranged for a decoy coach to pose as a getaway and draw away the crowd. Over 100 constables braced against the angry crowd, armed with clubs and rocks, as Hare was paraded into the coach before climbing out the back and into another awaiting vehicle. After making his escape, he spent the night at the local jail. Escorted by the Dumfries sheriff and a guard of militia, he was snuck out of town before dawn the next day, on his way to the English border. Some say he spent his final days a blind beggar on the streets of London. Some say he was tracked down by an angry mob of vigilantes and beaten to death. Others say he was quietly assassinated by a competing group of resurrection men and disposed of in a lime quarry where he was never found. His fate remains a mystery. Perhaps the most poetic conclusion of the story is the slang that developed afterwards. Following the horrific events, the crime became known as Burking. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, Be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.